Hello everyone, it is me, Atari H&B, and today's video is going to be a very crucial topic, and that is the importance of interpretation. Now, interpretation is one of the crucial key elements to any type of power scaling because it makes the difference between whether or not a character can go a tier up or a tier below, especially when it comes to a versus battle, because it can make the difference between a winnable victory and a pure spite. I'm going to go into a bunch of examples, but before we go into any examples, let's first talk about the holy triforce of power scaling. And the holy triforce of power scaling is we generally use three particular segments to power scale: feats, statements, and lore. Now these are typically the bread and butter to power scaling for the most part. These are what you're generally going to use when it comes to power scaling. Of course, feats is highlighted in red because that's the one people see to be the most important. Statements in yellow because, again, it stands out, but it's not as dynamic as red, but it still holds some merit. And lore, something a lot of people kind of ignore simply because lore is part of the general overall story and how the story wants us to interpret it. Basically, the author's intent. And of course, there's a lot of intricate details and complexities when it comes to these three simple elements, but overall, the power scaling purposes of these is that we need these three in order to hold some level of scale. And they all have their own individual tiering when it comes to low end, mid end, and high end, which are the other three holy segments. In fact, there's even a different procedure for each of them. Low-end scaling is generally more so in the feats category, whereas high-end scaling usually utilizes statements and lore a little bit more in favor of getting a greater outcome. But overall, as a result, I would say that mid-end is something that tries to utilize all of them in a nice harmonious way, as you could see by this Venn triagram I have. Why don't I go ahead and give you an example of what I mean by feats, statements, and lore. If we go ahead and look at some of the feats that were performed from Luisa Madrigal, she can clearly lift up a bridge, and she can clearly lift up an entire church. So building level isn't too far-fetched, obviously, but if you pay attention to statements made throughout the movie, it's implied she could lift entire mountains. Don't believe me? Take this for example.
The crust of the earth is...
Okay.
I move mountains, I move churches, and I glow cause I know what my worth is.
Of course.
So not only did she just throw a boulder on top of herself and tank it no difficulty, we literally seen her lift an entire church, which is true to her statement. But then she also says, I move mountains and move churches. So can she actually move a mountain and there was no place in the movie for her to actually do it? You may think of it as similar to Super Perfect Cell. You know, the guy who could destroy an entire solar system. Sure, it's a statement, but does the character know what they're capable of? And that's kind of the same thing for Luisa Madrigal. In fact, in her song, she actually one-shots an entire iceberg. So when you think about it, is it just for a cinematic effect, or is it true and she can do that? It's just there's no point of her ever doing it because why would she ever need to, punch an entire mountain? It would kind of be pointless when you think about it. But I digress. The whole reason is, despite the fact that we don't see her do it, and we only see her do it in a, rather hypothetical, cinematic, flashy song, it still makes you wonder, can she actually do it? And that's when it comes down to feats, statements, and lore. The lore kind of supports this, her statement supports it, and I guess the song's, showcasing feats supports it. So obviously, it's going to depend solely on how that interpretation is given. But overall, we're going to dive a bit deeper, of course, to find out exactly what I mean utilizing other fictions to get a greater understanding. Okay, so obviously we know that Luisa is mountain level based on the song and, obvious interpretations depending on the matter. However, a low-end scaler would probably not count it at all and say it's hyperbole, as annoying as that can be, but it's low-end, which is mostly feats only. Of course, a high-end interpretation would assume that, she can clearly do this to something like Mount Everest, which actually scales above island level, and arguably small country level. So depending on how you want to look at that, well, you can interpret a high-end Lisa Madrigal to be small country level, which is kind of insane for a Disney movie. Then again, we do have this character, so I guess it's not completely insane. Now, let's go into a couple of more examples to make it more vividly easier to understand. When it comes to characters like Super Perfect Cell, we'll go back to him, he said he could destroy the entire solar system. Now again, to what degree do we take him seriously, and how strong is the magnitude of his ability? Would he be able to destroy just the general star and end the rest of life on the solar system area? That's a low-end interpretation. And on a mid-end interpretation, we'd look at the accrued feats from other characters, the statement of Cell himself, basic transitive property, and statements from the data book, which claims the nebula is the solar system per se is a galactic nebula, which way back in the day, nebula was somewhat synonymous with a small galaxy, so depending on how you interpret it, could really mean that Cell is galaxy level. When you look at what Frieza did obviously prior, it holds merit. Keep in mind, this is a mid-end scaling, and since that feat didn't occur in the manga, most people would still assume that even manga Cell could destroy up to the Oort cloud, which is near the edge of Alpha Centauri. But higher end scalers may interpret this to be completely different depending on how they're going to look at it. But again, that's really what it comes down to, how you're interpreting it. Again, neither of these interpretations are inherently wrong because it's the interpretation off of a statement, not an actual feat. And heck, even certain feats have different interpretations because some low-end scalers will probably just assert that, well, this is only city block level for Yusuke when he did this to Toguro, and some will assert that it's multi-city block level and it still arguably destroyed a mountain off in the distance simply because the later ray gun dwarfed the entire island at some point for the manga. So again, it depends solely on how people are scaling it. Some people will say that's an inconsistency to scale and Yusuke is only multi-city block level. Some will say he's island level like myself for the manga, and some will say, well, he's continental if you use the anime. It just solely depends on how you're really going about the scale, and there's much more examples to go about. Now, of course, if we move on to the next topic, remember the Versus Battle Wiki is full of a bunch of morons who decided that you can't use Tyndall's continental statements unless you have more context. Well, I don't know. Let's count how many times it occurs and how many times Ichiro Oda is trying to give us context. 1, 2, 3, and 4. Okay, so there's 4 clear statements that it's continental, so I don't see any other argument about it. However, let's continue on with the main point. And that main point, hold up. Let's just look at this again. Supposedly splitting the ice continent? He did it! He actually did it! Okay, anyway, I digress again. The point is, there are many ways you can interpret Chenjiao's feat. The way I like to look at it comes from a variety of different angles. Some people on a low-end scale will say it's relatively large island level to at least country level, which kind of makes sense given the hardness of the actual ice sheet, and of course the assertion that he split the entire thing on the horizon, at least based on the screenshot, to the radius. Though to be fair, it obviously didn't split behind him. But the main point is, on a low-end scale, that's probably where he'd place around, just on an estimation. Of course, if a mid-end scale was utilized, we'd use the lore, which confirms he split a continent for sure, but we'd also use context within the series. As a island in One Piece / country like Alabasta has consistent scaling to place it as large as Australia, which is absolutely insane because that is essentially a continent right there, but it's considered an island in One Piece. It's kind of similar to Dragon Ball, how a solar system can be a galactic nebula, an island can be the size of a continent, at least in One Piece context. Though not consistently for all islands, of course. I'm not going to go that far. But just keep in mind that continent doesn't have to always be compared to Antarctica or something like that just because it's made of ice. And we should also look at other statements that give supporting details. Garp, for example, claimed he destroyed 8 entire mountains into dust, training for this moment. Now, mountains look like this in One Piece, or at least this is one of the bigger mountains, which based on general scale and sizing of Alabasta in this screenshot here, well, let's just say the reverse mountain based on realistic proportions to the One Piece planet and One Piece's planet's general size. The reverse mountain based on the actual pixel scaling in one of the stray islands being Alabasta, as it's the biggest one, would make Reverse Mountain as long as 67,629.8 kilometers, which is basically almost double that of the Earth. So when you think about it, destroying Reverse Mountain is not quite, but very close to pretty much destroying an entire planet-sized Earth. Yeah. No, this is not calc stacking, and no, I'm not trying to create any level of hyperbole, but then again, that kind of makes sense when you consider all the other stray planets that orbit such a planet as One Piece's world. So, yeah. Now again, just because this sounds far-fetched, don't let incredulity blind you. It's still fiction at the end of the day, so a lot of these things are possible, and neither scale is inherently wrong. Even low-end scalers will likely acknowledge One Piece's planet is highly likely not the size of a normal planet Earth, but even so, it all depends on the individual. I mean, there's a Skypiea for crying out loud, so I don't really think they'll follow about the same rules of, oh, it's a bigger planet, higher gravity. That's not always necessarily true. So those are my typical favorite low-end, mid-end, and high-end scaling, and those are the ones I favor the most and I feel are the best ways to get a good example of what I'm talking about. When it comes to a debate, you're really not going to use rather it's low-end, mid-end, or high-end scaling because again, neither of them are wrong and all of them have arguments that can go back and forth, you know. The whole point is to reach the middle, where you can have the feed statements and lore be cohesively binded into a nice objective rhetoric. Because that's the whole point, is to be the most objective as you possibly can. And to be honest with you, that's extremely difficult unless the author makes a very specific statement on how strong a character is and he's consistent with what he shows in his series. I think something like Her Summon is a little more consistent when it comes to scaling, well, realistic scaling. I mean, look at the size of this thing. It's actually the size of a mountain and like you can't see the characters at all or even indicate they're even down there, which is really good proportionated scaling. But most things in Naruto, I mean, come on now, look at this thing. This thing is absolutely monstrous. It's like a multi-mountain size structure, and then all of a sudden, I guess Onoki decided that he can grow a kilometer tall? But again, that goes into inconsistency and scaling inconsistencies and many other factors. Again, it's really difficult to do this because you have to gather everything you can to come out with the best average. That's typically the mid-end scaling. And personally speaking, I like mid-end scaling the most, but usually when I do these things, such as on my little polls I'll have, or the alpha team and omega team, etc., I'm only doing high ends so certain characters can stand more of a chance because I'm not sure if Escanor being planetary is high end or just kind of common sense because of the Demon King scaling. Or I'm not sure if Shanks being planetary is high end because One Piece planetary meta is still very under development. You know what I mean? So again, depending on the meta and the development of each fiction that's scaling, those will change. Back in the day, Yu Yu Hakusho's mid-end scaling used to just be, well, island level. And then its high-end scaling was, well, planet level. But now that we've developed the Yu Yu Hakusho power scaling community a lot more, well, low-end Yusuke is continental for the most part, and mid-end Yusuke is multi-planetary to arguably dwarf star, whereas high-end Yusuke is solid star level to almost large star level, depending on how you want to go about it. So regardless, the way it works is the more the particular versus community power scales them, the more development it gets, thus the meta increases. It's kind of like Smash Brothers. The more people who play a specific character, the more things that character can do, because new players discover new things and new techniques that will be utilized more accurately. For example, Marth had a lot of things he could do, and a lot of people think Marth is a bad character. But although I've had some combos myself I've came up with back in the day, and a couple of other Marths have, players such as Ignis, no, Ignace, I think that's how it's pronounced, has been doing a lot better with him. And as a result, people are having a lot more faith in Marth, utilizing more combos and tips that have been recently discovered, or relatively, I should say, recently put to the public, I guess is a better word to put it. Other than that, that's exactly how it works with the same thing when it comes to power scaling. The meta needs to develop for each individual verse, and it needs to include the feats, statements, and lore, and try to cohesively make them all work together under a mid-end scaling. At least that's my preference. But tell me, what do you guys think? Are you a low-end scaler, a mid-end scaler, or a high-end? Leave it in the comments below. Oh, and by the way, the reason I do this is because I don't want you guys arguing like Hiei and Kuwabara in the comment section over, oh, he's planetary, no, he's continental. It doesn't really matter. It's all dependent on where you place him on a low-end, mid-end, and high-end scale. Again, the key is to have it balanced in the mid-end because that's more objective since it considers most of the categories. And again, this isn't the end-all be-all definition, this is just the way I wanted to coin these particular buzzwords when it comes to the power scaling community and give us a lot more direction and, a more grounded surface area so that people can really start laying out the foundation for how they interpret their individual characters. Again, this has been Atari HMB, and thank you so much for watching. Be sure to give it a like, subscribe, and comment. Also, have a burning video request? Well, if you want a particular character that you want scaled in a particular category, be sure to check out my Patreon again, and you can make a video request if you don't have the time to wait for me to get to that character particularly. But again, now I can finally say I'm signing off. Peace.